Flatwounds. There are 5 main types of bass strings, 5 common string materials, and 7 set configurations that shape how a bass sounds, feels, and responds. Some make your tone brighter, some make it warmer, and some make your fingers question your life choices. So let's start with the first type of string. Before bright modern bass tone became the standard, flatwounds were basically the only bass strings players used. And even today, they still produce one of the most recognizable bass tones ever recorded. Flatwounds use a smooth ribbon-like outer wrap instead of the textured round wire found on most modern strings. That one difference completely changes the sound and feel of the bass. They sound warmer, thicker, smoother, and far more controlled, with less finger noise and a stronger low-end fundamental. Translation: your bass sounds less clang-clang refrigerator factory and more expensive vintage record. That deep, warm bass sound on countless soul, Motown, jazz, and classic rock records? Flatwounds were a huge part of it. Jamerson famously used them during the Motown era, and players like Pino Palladino and Steve Harris still use them today because flats sit in a mix differently. They sound focused, thick, and incredibly smooth. And there's another thing players notice immediately. They feel stiff. Not because they hate you personally, but because the smooth winding sits tighter together with very little spacing. The strings resist movement more, which can make them feel higher tension compared to roundwounds. The upside is they are smoother on your fingers and fingerboard. Sliding across flats feels almost weirdly polished. And just when you think flatwounds sound outdated, modern bassists started bringing them back again. Vintage-inspired bass tones exploded in popularity over the last decade, and suddenly flats became cool again. Roundwounds. Roundwound bass strings were introduced by Rotosound in 1962 with the original swing bass set, and the timing could not have been more perfect because music was getting louder. Rock bands were becoming bigger, drummers were hitting harder, guitarists were stacking amplifiers like they were preparing for war, and bass players suddenly had a serious problem. Nobody could hear them. Flatwounds sounded warm and smooth, but in loud rock mixes, bass could disappear underneath distorted guitars and crashing drums. So Rotosound created roundwounds to give bass more brightness, attack, sustain, and clarity. And the difference was dramatic. Roundwounds use a round outer wire wrapped around the string core, which gives them that textured feel and sharper tone. Suddenly, bass notes had bite. Harmonics jumped out more. The bass could actually fight for space in the mix instead of politely asking permission. And one of the earliest players connected to the sound was John Entwistle from The Who worked closely with Rotosound during the 1960s to improve the strings. Now, bass was not just background support anymore. It had attitude. Bands like The Who, Pink Floyd, Yes, and Led Zeppelin helped push this brighter bass sound into mainstream rock music. Suddenly, bass lines became more aggressive, more audible, and way more expressive. And honestly, this is probably why modern bass culture became obsessed with brightness. Once players heard that extra attack and sustain, it completely changed expectations. Roundwounds and flatwounds became the 2 dominant bass string identities, and bass players have been debating them ever since like it's ancient philosophy. Flatwound players say roundwounds sound too harsh. Roundwound players say flatwounds sound like somebody put a blanket over the amp. Meanwhile, half the audience cannot hear the difference because they're listening through laptop speakers from 2012. And to be fair, roundwounds do come with trade-offs. They produce more finger noise, they are rougher on fingers and fretboards, and after enough sweat, oil, dirt, and late-night emotional slap bass sessions, they eventually lose brightness over time. But even with those drawbacks, roundwounds became the modern standard because they gave bass something it desperately needed in the 1960s: presence. In some ways, modern rock bass without roundwounds would probably sound completely different. Halfwounds. Now, eventually some bass players found themselves stuck between 2 worlds. They liked the brightness of roundwounds but hated the noise, roughness, and extra clank. At the same time, they liked the smoothness of flatwounds, but sometimes found them too dark or too controlled. So companies basically looked at this situation and said, what if we created a string for people who cannot emotionally commit? And that led to halfwounds, sometimes called half rounds or groundwounds. These strings were pioneered and popularized popularized by D'Addario in the late 1970s through their XL half-rounds line. The idea was clever. Take a round-wound string, then grind down the outer winding so it becomes smoother. So instead of being fully textured like round-wounds or fully smooth like flats, half-wounds sit somewhere in between. In reality, they are one of the most underrated bass strings ever made. They keep some of the brightness and articulation of round-wounds but reduce finger noise significantly. That annoying scratching sound from sliding across strings becomes much softer, which is why recording musicians often appreciate them, because nothing ruins a beautiful bass take faster than sounding like somebody's sanding furniture in the background. D'Addario also used pure nickel wrap wire in some of these designs, which naturally gives a warmer tone compared to brighter modern wraps. Combined with the grinding process, the result becomes balanced, smooth, and controlled without fully losing definition. And this is why half-wounds became known as the middle ground option. Not too bright, not too dark, not too rough, not too smooth. They are basically Switzerland in string form. Even though they solve a lot of problems, half-wounds remain surprisingly niche. Most players immediately jump toward either flats or rounds because those two have stronger identities and more famous history behind them. Half-wounds exist in the strange space where experienced bass players quietly respect them, while beginners barely know they exist. Interestingly, that almost makes them cooler. Tapewounds. If flatwounds sound vintage, tapewounds sound like they own a vinyl collection worth more than your car. Tapewound strings are completely different from most bass strings because instead of ending with exposed metal winding, they use a nylon outer wrap around the string. And the moment you touch them, you immediately understand why people either love them or feel deeply confused by them. They are incredibly smooth, and tonally, tapewounds go in a very different direction too. Players constantly describe them using words like warm, round, soft, deep, thumpy, rootsy, and upright-like. They produce less string noise and a more subdued attack compared to brighter string types. According to one source, they are often considered the closest thing to upright bass tone you can get on an electric bass. The truth is that description is pretty accurate. Players often associate tapewounds with that soft, thumpy McCartney-style bass tone, especially when combined with old-school foam muting techniques from the 1960s. That combination creates this thick, pillowy bass sound that almost feels nostalgic, even if you never lived through that era. And another interesting thing is the feel. Because of the nylon wrap, tapewounds feel softer and easier on the fingers. Some players compare the feel somewhere between a classical guitar and upright bass, which honestly sounds beautiful until you hand your bass to a hardcore metal bassist expecting stainless steel aggression, and suddenly they look emotionally betrayed. But tapewounds are not trying to dominate a mix with brightness. They are trying to create mood, depth, warmth, that soft thump sitting underneath a song. And in roots music, blues, jazz, dub, vintage pop, and acoustic style settings, that sound can be incredible. The funny part is some bass players try tapewounds once and immediately become obsessed. Others try them and react like they accidentally downloaded the wrong personality pack. There's almost no middle ground. Coded. Eventually, bass companies realized something important. Bass players are disgusting. Sorry, that sounds harsh, but seriously, sweat, oils, humidity, dirt, and everyday playing slowly destroy strings over time, especially uncoated ones. And this became a major problem because dead strings lose brightness, clarity, and responsiveness. So companies started developing coated strings. The basic idea is pretty simple. Coated strings use a thin protective polymer layer to help block moisture, grime, and corrosion. Uncoated strings do not. Ernie Ball became one of the major names in this conversation through technologies like Everlast coating, which they say was developed using nanotechnology from Princeton University, which sounds incredibly advanced considering most bass players are still arguing inside music stores about whether tone lives in the fingers or the wallet. The goal of coated strings is longer life without destroying tone, because historically many players complained coated strings sounded duller or felt slippery. Some musicians loved the durability but hated the response. This debate still exists. Some bassists swear coated strings last forever. Others play them once and act like the strings committed tax fraud. Ernie Ball claims their Everlast coating avoids major tone loss because the coating is extremely thin, while their Paradigm strings also use something called plasma enhancement to improve durability and consistency. The entire section represents a more modern evolution of bass strings. Flatwounds and roundwounds were created mainly for tone. Coated strings were created to preserve tone. That's a very different philosophy, and depending on how much you play, where you live, how sweaty your hands get, or how often you avoid changing strings out of pure laziness, coated strings can either feel life-changing or completely unnecessary. Okay, now let's talk about what these strings materials are actually made from. Stainless steel. Stainless steel strings are basically the loud personality of bass strings. They're brighter, sharper, and more aggressive than most other materials. That's why rock, metal, punk, and fusion players love them. The harder stainless alloy also makes them feel rougher and more responsive under the fingers. They hold up very well against sweat and corrosion, especially during touring. The downside is they can wear frets faster over time. Amazing for aggressive playing, slightly terrifying for vintage fretboards. Pure nickel. Pure nickel strings are known for a smoother, warmer, and more vintage-style tone compared to brighter modern materials. Since pure nickel contains at least 99.6% nickel, it also resists corrosion very well. If you ask me, these are the classic record strings. They do not scream for attention, but they sit beautifully in a mix. Pure nickel also reacts differently during grinding, producing very dim sparks, which somehow feels incredibly fitting for a material associated with calmer vintage tones. Nickel-plated steel. Nickel-plated steel became popular because it balances warmth and brightness better than most materials. You get the strength and snap of steel underneath with a smoother nickel coating on top. That combination gives these strings a more balanced, modern tone without sounding too harsh. They also feel stiffer and springier under the fingers compared to pure nickel. Honestly, this is probably the most default modern bass string material around. Safe, versatile, reliable, basically the Honda Civic of bass strings. Cobalt. Cobalt strings feel like somebody took regular strings and turned the saturation slider up slightly. Ernie Ball's cobalt strings became popular because they sound bigger, more vibrant, and more aggressive without becoming painfully bright. Players constantly describe them as edgy or juicier, especially for lead parts, rock, blues, and modern styles. They also feel unusually silky and flexible under the fingers. Some players absolutely love that lively clang. Others hear it once and immediately start adjusting EQ knobs. Nylon. Nylon wound bass strings are designed for players chasing warmth, softness, and more mellow feel. Unlike traditional all-metal strings, they use nylon wrapping alongside metal components, often silver-plated copper. That combination creates a tone that feels round, warm, and expressive while still keeping some clarity and projection. They are especially popular in folk, flamenco, and classic style playing. Another thing players notice immediately is how much softer and smoother nylon strings feel under the fingers, compared to stainless steel strings. Let's talk about the setups bass players actually use. Gauges. String gauge is basically how thick or thin the string feels. Light gauges have less tension and feel easier to play, while heavy gauges feel tighter and can handle a stronger plucking hand. Medium is the safest middle option for most players. Tonal changes exist, but they're usually subtle. Nobody gets extra life points for suffering through heavy strings like bass in an Olympic sport. Scale length. Scale length is the distance from the nut to the bridge, and it affects tension, fret spacing, and tone. Short scale basses are usually around 30 inches, medium scale around 32 inches, long scale around 34 inches, and extra long scale around 35 to 37 inches. Longer scales usually feel tighter and brighter, while shorter scales feel warmer, softer, and easier to play. 5-string sets. A 5-string bass usually adds a low B string below the normal E, A, D, and G tuning. That gives players deeper notes without detuning the whole instrument. It's especially useful for gospel, metal, R&B, modern worship, and any style that needs heavier low end. The trade-off is wider neck feel, closer string spacing, and more notes to control cleanly. 6-string sets. A 6-string bass usually adds both a low B and high C, giving the player more range in both directions. It's popular for soloing, jazz, fusion, gospel, and advanced melodic playing. The neck is wider, and the layout can feel confusing at first. You pick it up thinking bass, then suddenly your fingers are applying for a mathematics degree. Drop tuning sets. Drop tuning sets are made for lower tunings where normal strings can feel too loose or floppy. In drop tunings, the lowest string is tuned down to reach deeper notes and heavier riffs. Heavier gauges help keep tension, clarity, and intonation stable. These sets are especially useful in rock, metal, alternative, and modern heavy music where low notes need to sound tight, not muddy. Tapered exposed core strings. Tapered strings are thinner near the bridge end, usually for large gauges like low B strings. This helps the string sit properly on the saddle and creates a cleaner contact point. Without that, very thick strings can struggle with intonation and produce odd overtones. Tapered ends are especially useful for 5-string basses, heavier gauges, and bridges with tighter saddle slots. Piccolo bass. Piccolo bass uses much thinner strings tuned higher than a normal bass, often E2, A2, D3, and G3, which matches the lower 4 strings of a guitar. Many piccolo basses are converted regular basses, usually needing a new nut for the thinner strings. Players like Joey DeMeo, John Patitucci, and Michael Manring have used piccolo bass for brighter, more melodic bass lines.